Welcome back to
Thanks
Capital
for having
Tonight. So we were talking about this a little bit before we came on the air. This is slightly different than what the consortium has asked for, and I did have a conversation not too far back about that. It's about 2.4
billion.
Okay,
yes.
so you're about 200 million, give or take, off.
We're in the same ballpark as both the Educational Conference Board and the regions. The regions have called for a $2.4 billion increase. ECB has called for a $2.2 billion. The main difference between ours and ECB's is that our proposal includes $300 million for what they call prior year adjustments, which are claims the school districts have submitted to the State Education Department for expenses that have already been incurred, just haven't been paid yet.
Right.
Whereas ECB's proposal doesn't include the $300 million, it's on top of their 2.2. So if you added the $300 million to their 2.2, they'd be at 2.5, and we're at 2.4. So it's the same, it's in the ballpark.
Right. It's really fascinating when you can say 200 million is ballpark.
Yes.
Anyway, but we will say this. I mean, generally speaking, everyone is on the same page with more.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And is it more because mostly due to the 2% property tax cap and the difficulty that local districts have in raising revenue on their own because it's so difficult to blow through that cap, and as we've discussed also on this show, the 2% property tax cap is a misnomer because it's actually closer to 0 next year? Well,
it's a combination of factors. One is what we all have in common, all three proposals, Regents, ECB, and ours, is that we're all asking for completely phasing out the GEA, the gap elimination adjustment. The reason it was instituted, I think, a couple of years ago was because the state had a fiscal crisis. And so they deducted money going to school districts. Well, there's no fiscal crisis. There hasn't been one now for at least 3 or 4 years. So the fiscal justification for the GEA no longer exists. Therefore, the GEA should be phased out.
Okay, but that's a couple $100 million at
that's
this point because they've
434.
slowly, right, all right.
So where we agree also is phasing in foundation aid, and both the ECB and Regents and ourselves all call for phasing in the foundation aid. We're calling for $800 million this year. ECB doesn't have an exact number, and Regents don't really have an exact number, but they're all talking about phasing in foundation aid. We all plan to phase in the GE or the foundation aid over 3 years after this year. So it's doable and it's reasonable, and the tax cap has a role to play in terms of asking how much more money we're going to be requesting, in terms of if school districts are not allowed to raise money locally, right, where are we going to get the money to pay for the various increases, and that's where the state needs to step up.
Okay, so here's the thing. Last year there was an historic increase in
6%,
education aid.
6.2, yeah.
And it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.4 to 1.6 to 1.2, depending on how you calculated
1.4,
it.
yeah.
In the neighborhood.
Right.
Right?
In the
okay,
neighborhood.
in the neighborhood. So that was a lot. I mean, you're talking about double, almost double.
Well, again, the state still has a lot of the money from the fiscal windfalls from these court cases and settlements with banks and insurance.
Not billion, though. 800 million, I think, was the last tally.
Well, yes, but they haven't spent.
That's true, but it's allocated, some of it.
True, yes, some of it is. And there were commitments made. Back in 2007, the foundation aid formula was developed. There was a commitment by the state then to phase in the foundation aid over 4 years. That got derailed. The GEA was a temporary fiscal fix. That needs to be restored. So there are commitments and promises that the state needs to fulfill to its school districts and to its students across the state.
Two things. Well, first of all, it's an election year, so you're in luck,
yes,
because everybody loves to spread money around
right,
in an election year. But it does come to mind. I mean, the small city school districts are in court right now, and,
right,
they're fighting over the allocation, and they say they've been shortchanged, which is basically the upstate version of CFE.
Correct.
For lack of a better
and
shorthand.
If foundation aid was phased in like it's supposed to, they would get their fair share.
But the problem here is there's no teeth. There's nothing to you say, well,
right,
the state promised this and the state promised
correct,
that, and the court said
right,
they should do this, and the court, whatever. But because there are different branches of government, one, the judicial, is really loath to force the legislative. And so there's nothing, you can go to court as much as you want, as far as I can tell. I mean, there's nothing to force these guys to do what they say they're going to do. So what's their word worth anyway?
There are other court cases in other states with similar issues, and it all relies on the legislature and the governor to fulfill those commitments. There's nothing that the courts can do to force them to give up the money. It's just sort of a moral, as we talked about before, more of a moral victory, and it's also setting a precedent saying, the courts agree with our position. Hey, state, you need to fulfill your commitments, to the public schools.
Well, right now, though, what we're having a conversation about, we're sort of having this weird esoteric conversation about policy as it relates to the Common Core, which you and I have talked about before, and the governor's task force commission, whatever it is, and that's going to make recommendations to him so he can give a State of the State address, including its recommendations within month or so. And allegedly, he's going to do an about face, or reportedly in the New York Times, he's going to do an about face on linking testing results with teacher evaluations. That's what we're talking about, right now. We're talking about policy. So it seems to me that you've got to clear out the policy problem before you can even talk about the funding problem.
Well, I think they're linked together. I think you can't do one without the other. In terms of the governor's about face on teacher evaluations, I think again it's an evolving position. I mean, the governor just last session was calling for higher testing and more evaluations. But again, I think it's important that that we have higher standards for our students, because we're competing globally and not just within our state, not within our nation, but we're competing globally. So we have to have higher standards. Whatever those standards are, we need to make sure our kids are becoming critical thinkers, problem solvers, and not just rote memorization. And so we need to have those kinds of skill sets in our kids. And everybody should be evaluated, whether they're teachers or principals or superintendents or legislators.
Well, we call that an election. But
yes, everyone is up for some sort of evaluation.
The thing is, though, the governor also, if I remember correctly, was really big into, and has been in all across the board in government, performance-based funding, right? I mean, and he was the one who wanted to link performance basis with, or performance achievements, if you will,
with competitive grant programs,
additional funding.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about that either. And every time we have a discussion about more funding, he says, well, prove it to me, because we're the highest per capita student pupil, blah, 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 and our funding right now, and our test results are not bearing that out, and we have these failing schools or struggling schools, et cetera.
Right.
And I mean, the danger that I see is that he could come by and say, okay, 2.4, great. I'm going to link half of that to performance-based standards, and that's not something that I think you'd support.
Well, again, it's hard to tie funding to something that's really kind of outside of our control. And so, a lot of blame has been laid on the teachers for how their students perform, but that's only half the picture. Really, it depends on what the parental involvement is. I mean, every report, every study you look at always points to, ultimately, it's the home environment that determines how well a student will do.
The community environment and the poverty environment and the healthcare environment.
A teacher's only given so much to work with, and they can't work miracles. And so, tying their evaluations and tying funding to those kinds of outcomes is I think, is a little bit unrealistic. I think some sort of evaluation should take place. We've always called for renewable tenure instead of these annual performance reviews. Tenure process is in place. You get new tenure every 3 or 4 years. You're evaluated over a 3 or 4 year period on tests over 3 or 4 years, so you can winnow out those spikes and anomalies in your testing scores. So there's a way of doing it without costing more money and creating more anxiety in testing for students.
Okay, so as you are asking for more money, you have the Empire Center putting out its annual report regarding salaries for educators and administrators, and this is the headline: 6-figure school pay up 55%. So the number of teachers and other school employees paid more than $100,000 by school districts outside of New York City climbed to 49,834 this year, and that's considerably larger than in 08-09, which was 32,179. So costs are clearly going up, and at one point in time, the governor, if I remember correctly, was targeting highly paid school superintendents and wanted a salary cap for them. Now, that didn't go anywhere.
No.
But certainly when this comes out, people say, well, you want more money, and yet you keep paying people more than $100,000, which is more than I make, they might say, right? So how do you justify that?
Well, during the recession and during cuts in state aid, there were a tremendous amount of layoffs among teaching staff and school staff. I think there was like close to 30,000 people laid off. A lot of those people that got laid off were lower rung, more newer teachers who got paid less. So what you were left with were older, more experienced teachers making more money, hence their pay raises, their pay scales are at the higher end. So you're going to see that going through the pipeline now. Also during the recession and when aid and local revenues were tight, you didn't have pay raises. So now school districts are trying to play catch up to keep and retain quality teachers and quality administrators. And just in terms of normal inflation, salaries are going up. Everybody's talking about the governor, the legislature talking about raising the minimum wage.
Yeah,
You know,
which
we're talking
will
about-
impact schools if
We're going
it
to impact
happens.
schools. So everybody's talking about making sure that people are being paid what they're worth. And so the same thing is happening with teachers and administrators.
And okay, so basically you're going to make this ask, just to be clear, the governor will put forth his executive budget, which will include whatever it is it includes. I mean, are you getting any feeling from
Well,
this?
I mean, according to the law that was passed with a tax cap, state aid is tied to growth in personal income.
Right.
So, I mean, I think DOB's latest projections were that it was going to grow by like $900 million. So we could expect as a floor around $900 million more in school aid, which is a nice floor to begin with.
Right.
And, you know, the legislature will add to that. So, you know, we're expecting something north of $900 million. I think definitely the 434 in GEA is very doable this year.
well, certainly the Senate Republicans have made that a top
Right,
priority.
and you know, again, there's no real justifiable reason to continue the GEA. You get rid of the GEA this year, we won't have to hear about it anymore. The legislature won't have to hear about it anymore, and then we can focus on fulfilling the foundation aid promise.
Okay, so we'll wait to see the executive proposal, and we'll go from there. Obviously, I mean, are you, just before we go though? Last year there was a lot of coupling, if I remember correctly, more so than I had ever seen before. And
Right.
so a lot of experts had seen before, and that the governor was seeking to force the legislature's hand by putting a lot of policy language in a budget document, which they don't have a whole heck of a lot of control over. They can raise numbers, they can lower numbers, they can strike numbers, but they can't change words, right? And so they negotiated it out at the end. Do you expect that again?
I don't know if it really worked out in the governor's favor, you know, so I mean, we have what is like 90% of the school districts have asked for a waiver
Yep.
or an extension to renewing their or renegotiating their APPR contracts. So, you know, I think we're not in favor of decoupling. I don't really think it produces the kinds of results the governor was looking for, so I don't know if it was really a productive tactic.
Well, right, they're seeking a waiver to a system that might actually end up being completely overhauled by the time they get around to.
Exactly, yeah, so it's kind of a wasted effort.
Yeah, a little bit. Well, Michael, thank you so much. We'll
Sure.
be checking back in with you in a couple of weeks, I'm
Yes.
sure, when we see the numbers, and I thank you so much.
Thank
for
you
your
for
time.
having me.